Hi everyone, welcome to episode 22 of Demand Decoded. Thanks for tuning in and taking the time to join us today. And I'm joined by Phil, as usual, to discuss how to transition to ungated first content. It's a popular topic at the moment, and I know it's something a lot of marketers have been considering doing, but perhaps get stuck on exactly how you make this transition. So in this episode, we're going to discuss exactly how you ungate your existing content and get the absolute most value out of it, and then how you start producing new content in an ungated first mindset. Looking forward to this one, Phil?
Indeed. It's really interesting because your content, or whatever format it's in, can work so much harder for your business and for your pipeline if it's ungated, not hidden, free to consume. But there's more to it than just taking your existing bits of content and ungating those by putting them on a page, for example, because it also changes, I think, the outlook that you have about content opportunities, the types of content and the topics and the subjects that you'll go after. So it's a bit of a symbiotic relationship between what are the tactical steps you can take now to unleash the potential of content you've already got, and how does that change and affect and influence the plans that you make and the things that you create going forward. So loads of reasons to do it, which we'll talk about more, tons of benefits, and a really interesting topic, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that this topic in itself is quite a tactical one. Ungating your content is just a relatively small but significant part of a strategic pivot, really, from a focus on generating a high volume of leads to starting to create your own demand. So it's worth bearing that in mind as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Okay, let's dive in. If you are watching live, feel free to ask questions in the chat on LinkedIn, or actually disagree with us if you want, and we can have a discussion around that. So yeah, just pop a comment on LinkedIn and then we can bring them up and discuss as we go. So I suppose, first of all, just to kind of frame this, if marketers haven't quite yet considered ungating their content, what are the reasons why they should do so?
Right. The number one reason to ungate your content is because if you want your buyer, your ideal customer, the people that buy from you, to be able to see it, then it has to be free to consume. If you want your buyers to see, read, watch, listen to the content you create that's a product of your sector knowledge, expertise, experience, and so on, then the worst thing you can do is lock it away from them behind a form. So we've talked numerous times about the woefully poor conversion rate from a typical content lead, a low intent lead, top of the funnel lead, through to closed one. Studies have found that that's as low as 0.02% in more than one case. We've witnessed ourselves the very, very low conversion rate that you can get on those sources, and we've seen it time and time again in the businesses we work with. And then to add to that, you've just shared with me, Dan, a very compelling stat, which is part of a LinkedIn study, which found that 81% of buyers surveyed would not download a piece of content if there were a form or a gate involved. So you have a choice. You can either target the 20% of the audience that will download your content and convert them at 0.0 something percent, or you can target the 80% of your buyer community, your addressable market, that will probably never download a piece of content from you behind a form, and who, if you are able to get into their shortlist, onto their preference list, then you have a far higher chance of generating a high intent lead in the first place, but ultimately turning that lead into pipeline and revenue thereafter. So stark difference in the outcomes that you can pursue if you move from the gated approach, which is still very, very prevalent and popular, to the ungated approach, which is to some quite unnerving, a bit scary, I'm sure, but all good, all worthwhile.
Yeah, and I wonder.
You answer that?
Yeah, I'm not too sure on the details of that LinkedIn study, but I wonder if the 81% of those buyers were actually on the like gated landing page itself in the first place, right? Because I think there's an issue here with gated content in itself, that it forces you to kind of push out really limited content and links back to a landing page, a lot of the time, rather than favorable formats in a lot of these channels, whether it's search in like ungated pillar pages and blog content, or social native in-feed content. If you're in a gated content mindset and strategy, you're likely just pushing out links to these landing pages. And yeah, I reckon that 81% is probably people who got to the landing page in the first place. And let's face it, most of your audience probably isn't even going to click that link to your landing page in the first place, because that's not the format they want to consume content in the first place. Like, they want to access it quickly. So no matter what channel they're in, it needs to be in that preferred format where they can consume it there and then without clicking elsewhere.
I'd add to that furthermore, it's not terribly hard to produce a landing page for a gated piece of content that has an attractive looking conversion rate. 25% is not unusual on landing pages for ebooks, recorded webinars, and the like. Yeah. But it's a deceptive measurement, because while it looks good in terms of how many visitors that arrive on that page do go on to complete that form and download that content, it's when you look at how they progress through the rest of the process and what percentage of those go on to buy from you that you start to see the issue with the approach. And like so many things that digital marketers have at their disposal, it's easy to optimize within the narrow definition of what you're sort of focused on, but it doesn't necessarily optimize for the ultimate goal, which is the growth of the revenue of your brand and company. So yeah, it's really important to consider that a great looking conversion rate on a landing page is not a sign of success unless it also translates into pipeline.
Yeah, and whilst we're on the topic of why you should ungate your content, it opens you up to a huge range of formats that you simply don't have access to with gated content, which is usually restricted into PDFs or some sort of website based thing hidden behind a form. With ungated content, you are really just unleashing the potential to be extremely creative, access channels that your audience use and want to consume content in. And with gated content, you simply don't have that. And the other point to that is that you might actually start having a bit more fun when it comes to marketing. Like, just producing gated content is boring. Like, there's a reason why B2B marketing is usually boring when you compare to B2C, because all you're doing is, writing white papers that get downloaded by 2 students. It's not fun, right? I think that's quite brutal, but it's true.
Yeah, there is some truth to that. Absolutely.
Okay, so yeah, definitely
passionately for ungating content.
Absolutely, if you can tell. All right. So we know why now you should ungate your content. And actually, I should plug the first episode of Demand Decoded, which was on gated versus ungated content. Because if you haven't watched or listened to that yet, we go a bit deeper into why you should and the kind of data that backs that up. But specifically on making this transition now, we want to touch on how you actually convert your current gated content into an ungated model. Because before you start producing ungated first content, before you make that move, that mindset, that strategic move, you're likely to have all of this current gated content that you can absolutely use and maximize to its full potential. So I think we were just going to talk through that, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Most businesses, just to expand, most businesses have a low-hanging fruit in front of them, which is the content they've already created that's in PDF form, because it's an ebook or it's a white paper or it's a guide. A lot of businesses will have those at their disposal. So as you say, before you go on to create new, you may as well take that opportunity, not only because it's there and it's easy, but because it is very impactful in some situations. Because ungating your existing PDFs, is a strong move in terms of creating new structure and power within your SEO strategy. So it's worth prioritizing and taking the opportunity that's presented. Don't want to duplicate what you're about to say, so I'll leave it there.
No, that's fine. And I think you make a great point. Like, so much time, effort, and energy probably went into creating those gated pieces of content because that was the kind of thing to do, or the thing that you thought was right. So it would be such a shame and a waste to just get rid of all of that and, delete your gated content when you can do so much more with it.
Yeah.
So when it comes to actually ungating your existing content, there's a couple of steps that you want to take. So the first one is to take that existing gated PDF, whether it be like an ebook or a guide, something on a meaty, probably kind of top level topic, and turn that into a pillar page. So by pillar page, Phil, jump in here, but it's a topical page on your website that goes in depth on a kind of top level informational subject.
Yeah, a comprehensive, usually long form piece of content that in most cases is very similar to what you find in an ebook on a subject. You'll find that you need to adjust it slightly for a ungated presentation, for search discoverability and so on. But yeah, it's usually going to be on a relatively short sort of keyword type topic, but cover it broadly, cover it comprehensively. And by doing so, it fits well into a structured SEO approach, and it's of interest to your readers.
Yeah. And like you say, there are a few things to do when it comes to the pillar page, like optimizing it for search. Whilst your PDF was great in PDF format, it probably isn't actually optimized with those keywords that you need in order for it to rank in search. And actually, we've just missed the key point here, which is why are you making this pillar page in the first place, right? You're ungating your PDF into a pillar page because it can then be found in search.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big sort of advantage, which is Google can index it. Google can therefore place it in search results on the same topic. And that means that most likely more people will discover it. Even if that weren't true, then we still stand by the fact that if your buyer can see it, it's working harder for you, because they'll be coming to it via other methods, as we'll talk about, the ways you can distribute it later, but internal links, CTAs, etc. But visibility to the buyer and visibility to the search engines are the two major strengths of this approach. But if you want it to perform well in that search context, then you are most likely going to have to look at and refine the title, some of the content, and the meta content as well, to make sure that it's aligned as close as it can be to a high volume, informational, relevant keyword that is likely to bring more buyers, more ideal customers to your website.
Yeah, and there's a reason we say pillar page here and not blog or some other page, and that's because pillar pages, in our sake anyway, but in most cases, they have a kind of designated template which has contents, and it's structured in a way to really break out content in a intuitive way and easy to kind of digest a really comprehensive piece of content, which is probably what your PDF does, with the contents at the start and page numbers and titles and that kind of thing. If you were to simply copy and paste that into a blog, it just wouldn't have the same readability and it wouldn't be able to be digested in the same way. But a pillar page, with the right template, with the right design, gives you what your ebook and what your guide had in PDF form in web page form.
Yeah, if push absolutely comes to shove, then I think as a temporary measure, a blog-esque template, can suffice. But the content's likely to be several times longer than a blog, and therefore, we prefer a template that's got some usability, readability considerations built in, some form of internal navigation that isn't, too distracting or too overwhelming. A structure that supports scanning the contents for the sections you're interested in, nice legible readability, same as the blog, but broken up and made digestible for people. And then by having a dedicated template for that content, it will likely perform better, be easier to create new and more of them. And you can also do different things, in terms of when and where you offer the optional download if you choose to do that, and so on. So it gives you the freedom to do that and take it in a slightly different direction to the blog post. But the absolute key for me is the reading experience. We've got to make our content always as easy to read as possible.
You just mentioned optional download, which you slid in there. Do you mind just doing a bit more of a kind of deep dive insight into what that is and how you can use it and if you should use it?
So, well, if is an ongoing debate in marketers' minds, I think, but lots of businesses are attracted to the ungated content proposition, but aren't either ready to give up on lead generation, or they see the opportunity to use the content to build a subscriber list, even though they're going to treat it in a relatively considerate demand generation-esque manner. And for that reason, an optional download of a pillar piece so that a person can take away that piece of content and read it at their leisure later without having to come back to your site is, in my mind, something that's perfectly okay to do if you want to do it. There's two primary ways you can do it, and that is have some sort of, again, optional button or conversion point on the page. You could have a form that appears or is visible. We've also seen exit intent pop-ups, and I don't often say pop-ups with a smile on my face. Exit intent pop-ups work quite well and appear not to be too antagonistic. So we all know and loathe pop-ups. When they interrupt what we're doing 2 seconds into the visit, it's horrible. It's really not adding value. It's adding friction. But if someone's 2/3 of the way, or even just a fraction of the way through a long piece of content and they're about to leave, offering them that as a download, I think is actually doing something for them rather than for ourselves. And so that's an okay way to do it. These days, you could try it with, slide in ones in the corner, a little less obtrusive, but you can still generate some contacts, an email audience, or heaven forbid, if you want to call them leads through optional download. I'll leave that up to the listener to decide.
Yeah. So when it comes to the optional download, I think just to clarify, the optional download is it's a PDF version of the pillar page, essentially. It is kind of your already existing gated content that you would have in this model, but it's just optional because the content is there, available on the page. You can just consume it there and then if you want. Or if you do want a PDF version, a gated version, as we're calling it, then you can have that too, because sometimes that is just a preferred format to consume content in.
There's probably a direction of travel, which is as people get started with this approach, they're more likely to be drawn to the optional download, as a way of hedging their bets a little bit. But as you see the pipeline impact of ungating content and improving your SEO through it, you might move along the spectrum and become more and more comfortable with the idea of not even attempting to gather contact details. You might still provide download, but without asking for details in return, or you might just give it up altogether, given that for the most part, people are reading online, quite comfortably, quite happily, and you can be satisfied with the credibility and the trust that the content's building, and not worry about lead generation at all.
Yeah, it's kind of up to the marketer, I suppose, isn't it? And
yeah, some have KPIs that can't be ignored, and some have strong preferences that they want to they want to continue to generate some of those contact details. We certainly did in the beginning, but there's a range of approaches that you can apply.
Yeah, cool. All right, let's move on that. So you've ungated your existing PDF into a pillar page that now kind of sits on your website. It's accessible via search. Buyers can find it, your audience can find it, people are actually consuming your content. So what else can you do with that existing gated PDF that you had? Well, one of the easiest things that you can then move on to is repurposing that for social. You're likely to have some images, I would imagine, that are used in the pillar page. Maybe it's like research or kind of graphs, like some sort of imagery, not kind of generic images, but things that are actually relevant to this topic and to you, that can then be distributed on social with content from that particular section of the pillar page. You can take key text sections of the pillar page, again, repurpose those for social. This is all focused on in-feed consumption too. What you really don't want to do is just kind of distribute links to that pillar page on social. People aren't likely to click off of their feed to that pillar page to consume it. But if you're giving kind of in-feed information, deeper insights onto that topic, in feed, then it's going to get consumed and engaged with more.
So would you say, Dan, that the key opportunity here is for marketers to use the fact that the content is now ungated and it's no longer secret, it's no longer private, to generate valuable content for in-feed consumption ideas, and not to link back to it, with a view of getting visitors to the landing page, period. It's about feeding the social appetite rather than being a way to promote the pillar page per se.
Yeah, like I said before, it's about then, once you start ungating your content, actually having access to these other formats that you can use. Like with the pillar page, the format is a web page that can then be accessed through search. With social content, the format is kind of imagery and text content that can then be consumed in feed. You don't have to click away from your feed. We know that social platforms don't want you to do that. They want to keep you on their social media platforms so they can then serve you ads and get ad revenue. Like it's quite understandable, and you can kind of comprehend what they're trying to do when you think about it. So yeah, really using that content then as a way to fuel your social content strategy is a great thing to do.
Yeah, it's good. Just while we're on the pillar pages, 2 points we stepped over. Quite often we found that the content doesn't need a wholesale rewrite to become ungated, but you might need to top and tail it differently. Often ebooks start like ebooks with introductions, and they end in ways that reflect the fact that they're in a PDF that someone downloaded. Thank you for downloading. Yeah. So you might want to top and tail it differently. We almost always did. And then internal linking from and to and from your new pillar page is key. So, using your blog post to link to your pillar page, updating calls to action so they reflect the fact that this is now something you can read rather than download is worth doing. Linking from your pillar page to your commercial pages is worth doing. And then there's only one point, we can cover it now or later, Dan, that it's worth watching out for. Sometimes an existing ebook that you ungate will invariably cannibalize your main commercial keywords. And in that case, I think it's worth restraining yourself in terms of internal linking, focusing on CTAs. But if you've got a nice informational keyword in your title of your pillar that's nothing to do with your main navigation and your commercial pages, then you can go all in on internal linking.
Yeah, great points. And we'll pick up at the end some more of those, or later on, just those things to be aware of when you're ungating content. Okay, so when you've ungated your content now. So it's ungated, it's on a pillar page, you started repurposing that content for social. What else can you now do to build upon that piece of ungated content? So I think you can split this into 4 main areas. So you've got what you can then do to kind of bolster it in search, what you can then do to use video and audio to support that content. What more can you do on social, and what can you do with email? So do you want to pick up search, Phil? Just go through one by one.
Well, so I mean, as I've kind of just touched on, it's a pillar page is a very strong SEO device that can help your website rank for a high volume informational term that just doesn't belong on your main navigation, but is still very attractive and relevant to buyers. And, you know, it will rank where it ranks, but you can improve that position through internal links and backlinks. And the easiest way to generate both is by creating more valuable written content on the subject, on the niche aspects of the subject. So continue to blog as you always have done, continue to blog around the topics that your pillar pages are on as you always have done, and continue to link and signpost people to the pillar content.
Yeah.
I say as you always have done, but quite often people haven't done that, and it's actually the key step to seeing sort of growth in your organic search traffic and your position for certain terms. So internal links, both exact match and semantic, for the informational keyword that your pillar page is optimized for, calls to action that, you know, connect relevant blog articles to relevant pillar pages, is step one and the fundamental, you know, way to maximize the value of the ungated content, the ungated written content that you've just created. Yeah.
Within search, I would probably also bundling it. Well, actually, I'll cover this afterwards because it goes hand in hand with the video audio format actually, but it's kind of connected to search. Anyway, so you've got your search ungated content working well. You've got the pillar page, you've got the blog content connecting to it, internal links are flowing. You might have a commercial page in there as well that's getting bolstered by internal links through your pillar pages and blog content. Now, what else can you do to kind of produce more content on this topic? A key one is kind of like we're doing here, through video and audio formats. So you might host a webinar or live event that gives you this great piece of like premium long form content, which is in a different format. It's not written, it's going to be video content essentially that you can then use and repurpose in lots of different ways. So the first one would be to kind of take that big piece of content, put it onto YouTube. You've got so many benefits of doing that. YouTube can then be seen in search. You can add that YouTube video to your blog, to your pillar page, you know, of that kind of main event or webinar. So it's kind of twofold there, right? Because people are finding it in search. People are also then going to be watching the video through your web page content. So great way to do that. You can then repurpose that into a podcast. And again, that can be found in obviously the podcast search engines themselves, whether that's Apple Podcasts or Spotify. But then you can also use that podcast in a lot of different places. So you can use that, again, embed it on within the pillar page content or the blog content if there's a place for it. You can then create, and this is where I'm coming back to search, a podcast listing on your website. So, you know, like we've got a Demand Decoded listing. Most podcasts will have a kind of live listing on their website where they then embed the YouTube video, embed the podcast player, and some have a transcript, some kind of have key takeaways from the podcast or webinar live event on the podcast listing kind of post page itself. And then that can then rank in search too. So people can find that through search. You can add internal links from that to your blog content, to your pillar pages, to your commercial pages. This is just creating like the ultimate multimedia hub content approach that can just be found in so many ways. And I'm just getting excited talking about it. And then, you know, to top it all off, you have the live engagement that you could get from webinars or live events that you host. So people are watching live, people might be having a discussion with you live and interacting. So yeah, that in itself is just a fantastic way to bolster that existing content that you've just ungated.
Yeah, and for lots of people that will be, you know, net new content opportunities that they've struggled perhaps to exploit in the past. I think anything that unlocks the sort of the motivation and the ideation to be able to embrace those formats in addition, I still think written, you know, in many cases will come first. Kind of doesn't have to come first, but it's still very effective. But if it's a springboard into the other medium channels, then that's so great for businesses going forward, because, you know, where our buyers are and where their attention is and what they're reacting to is changing, evolving all the time. And more than ever, it's favoring those formats.
Yeah. And, you know, thinking about how they all interconnect and all of these efforts from one piece of gated content that then spans into so many different areas is really exciting and a great use of time and resource. Yeah. So the next area to focus on, as we kind of spoke about before, is social content. But now you've got that big piece of video and audio content, you can go a step further on this. So if you do have a webinar or a live event that you did on the same topic, you can then chop that up, kind of take the best clips that are most thought-provoking, maybe like clickbait worthy, to get that engagement on social, distribute that to, you know, your organic feed, people at the company's organic feed that might have taken, you know, part in the webinar. And you can also then put some paid distribution behind that. So you can kind of take those clips and that great content that you've just produced, those clickbaity moments, and pay to distribute it to the exact people that you want to see it. You know, use LinkedIn brand awareness campaigns as a way to actually guarantee that this content gets to the right people that you want to see it.
Yeah, I think it's important to take the right mindset when it comes to executing the paid side of things, you know, and be awake to and alert on the fact that it might not be the typical performance-based metrics that you're looking to optimize around, but simply, you know, our networks are usually not chock full of our unknown to us ideal customers, and therefore reaching the ideal base of people to build that affinity with them is, you know, paid's a way to do that. So it's definitely something to be considered.
Yeah, like it's still going down the right route of social that is in feed. Like all of this is being optimized to be consumed right there in the feed itself. You're not looking for clicks back to landing pages anymore. You're focusing on as many people consuming your content as possible.
Yeah, which affects the metrics you look at and the goals that you set yourselves, but it's still a very valuable way to do it.
Yeah. Cool. So the fourth bucket group that I've got on here is email. And I find myself doing less and less email at the moment, but I think it's still a channel worth having in there, because, you know, once you've got that pillar page content, that blog content, those podcasts, that live event, webinar, you know, these great pieces of content, if you do have an email list that is engaged, that you can use, then I suppose there is no harm in then distributing that content in a newsletter, or having your blogs linked up to a digest that then sends this in a different channel, I suppose. What are your thoughts on email?
It's an interesting topic. You know, when we consider what buyers are doing today, what their behavior is telling us about how they want to, you know, engage, research, buy, and so on, you know, it drives so many demand generation tactics away from capturing email data that you have to question, well, what's the role of email? And yet it's still, a widely highly regarded channel with great performance results in some senses. So it's a bit of a dichotomy in my mind. And a case in point, I use a great bit of software called Sane Later. Microsoft tries to do something similar with Clutter, but it's never been as good as Sane Later, in my opinion, which siphons off all the junk spam nurturing, cold outreach email that I get into a separate space where I can ignore it. And wow, the rate at which that fills up is just insane. Dozens of emails a day that I just delete, and I have no interest. I scan them to make sure that no one slipped in there, incorrectly, because of course that is always the risk, because it's not being identified as spam. It's just email that I've not asked to receive, and I ignore it wholesale. So it's like, well, why email people? On the flip side of that coin, if you've got subscribers, if you're generating subscribers, for the right reasons and in good ways, then you've got an audience that may want to receive certain types of quality email from you. And pillar content, ungated content can be the catalyst, the trigger to distribute something to that audience. In the grand scheme of things, I'm pretty staunchly anti-lead nurturing email, because I don't see that B2B buyers want to receive those from me. The exception in my book is blog digest, which might be driven and triggered by your ungating activity, because those blog digests have a way to reach a buyer or an audience member in a non-pushy, non-salesy, non-wanty way, with new content with very low effort and lift from the marketing team, which is one benefit. But it also doesn't alienate and push away the recipient quite the same way as those, kind of manipulative sequenced emails that you get. Are you joining me on the call? That sort of thing. So I'm okay with. I see some positive benefits and results from distributing blog content via blog digest, and I think you can generate. It's certainly possible to produce newsletter quality content. Requires a lot of effort. I think it needs to be kind of your main focus. It's right for some businesses and not right for others. But you can be in a place where you can distribute a really high quality newsletter and have it received and read and put into the right inbox and so on. So I think just treat it with a little bit of, balance. Don't go overboard on it. It's probably not, as we go forward, for most businesses, going to be the thing that gets people, banging on the door to buy. But it can be a way to distribute quality content that you've created or ungated to your willing subscribers.
Yeah, and when you say distribute that content, is it fair to say that the best way to kind of distribute content in an email is to do so within the body of the email, as opposed to having to click then onto your website? Or is that still a good way? Because I know if I'm receiving emails, I'm probably more likely to consume the content that's there in the email than to click through, unless the click through is kind of the only thing within the email that you can do, like the blog digest.
Yeah, tricky one. Probably worth investigating and testing some approaches. I mean, I certainly, there are email newsletters I receive where the content's in the newsletter, in the email, and I read it in the newsletter, in the email, and I respect the person sending it. But I wouldn't just paste a pillar page into an email and send it that way. So that's food for thought. That's something that I think we probably need to come back to as a topic.
All right, let's do it next year. Okay, so that's what we had in terms of those 4 groups that you can really utilize to build upon that piece of ungated content you now have. So, just to recap that, so you've ungated your content onto a pillar page. You're now maximizing its reach and potential on search through pillar pages, through blog content, through your podcast listing. You're using video and audio based content to cover that topic in a different format and potentially even more detail. So that webinar and live event now exists on YouTube. That YouTube video and potentially clips from that are embedded on your blogs, in your pillar page, in your podcast listing. The podcast itself is generating traction on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, all of these places. That can also feed into the podcast listing, which is available on search. Again, more traffic to your website from search. You've got the live engagement from the webinar and live event potentially. Again, using social now, using those video clips from the webinar or live event to then distribute content, in-feed content on social, paying to distribute that, and then potentially using all of that great content to push out to an engaged email list, whether that be in newsletter form or pushing your blog content through a blog digest. So, after you do all that, you're in a pretty good place, right? You're making your content more discoverable, more consumable, and I suppose contributing to the likelihood that somebody will find your content. Your audience will see it.
Yeah, and I think I'm correct in saying that most, if not all of that, was possible before, available to marketers before, but the ungated content format and the ungated content mindset, I think, makes it so much more accessible, and is a catalyst to doing those things. And anything that can catalyze your ability to embrace those channels, those mediums, and that diversity is a great thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we just cover some top tips that we kind of mentioned more at the start on what not to do when you're ungating your current gated content, what are some of those mistakes that you should just avoid avoid?
Yeah. Well, I think the first one that we both agreed on and came into both of our feeds coincidentally recently was like it isn't enough to take a PDF and remove the form, but keep the PDF. And it's funny because that's the sort of thing that I sometimes overlook, and assume that we've made clear, but reading PDFs online is not a good experience for users, especially the flippy ones that have weird controls that you've never engaged with before and require you to turn pages and zoom in and out. That's not how people want to consume this content. So don't, to use your words, ungate literal PDFs, ungate the content. Well, I think that's really important.
And the point on that as well is that if you literally just remove the form but keep the PDF, so you have a button on your resources page or whatever that says download content, people still aren't going to find it.
No,
so
search is it's not good for search. It can't be indexed fully. You every now and then you see a PDF show up in search, but it's usually a mistake rather than a positive decision, and it's not a good way to surface that content via search. So it's a definite no.
Yeah, absolutely. The next one that we had on the list was not ungating things if they're time constrained. I think that was yours, Phil, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it's ultimately we've all got to prioritize our time and our investment, and in some situations content just isn't evergreen, and if you've got the choice between ungating something that's got longevity and something that's time constrained, it's written about a specific event, or it's written about a specific trend that's short-lived, or a specific period in time, that probably isn't going to be the best performing pillar page that you can produce. Now, far be it from me to say don't ungate it. It's probably still better off ungated than gated, but it wouldn't be the thing that I prioritize and I put at the center of an SEO strategy because of the time factor, and I mean, basically, as we know, if you look at blog posts that have the year in the title, 2023 for example, there will be very clear trends in terms of how, when people find them via search, what the click-through rate is. Now, it will vary depending on topic and industry and so on, but ultimately a piece of content titled 2023 isn't going to perform forever. And that's true of a pillar page too. So it's prioritize the content that's evergreen, that's got longevity, and, you know, maybe only take along the other stuff if you've got tons of spare resource, but otherwise you can let that go, let that sort of dwindle a little bit, and refocus the internal links away from that in time and push the stuff that's got real lasting power.
Yeah, nice one. The next one I would add in terms of what not to do, and again, it relates to the pillar page that you're using to ungate that PDF, and it's not to treat it like you've treated your landing pages in the past. So removing the navigation, having some sort of limited footer, that kind of thing. It still just needs to be a website page. If somebody wants to explore more on your website, go deeper into other pages, you know, let them do that. We're not trying to force them into anything here. It's purely just giving them a way to consume content.
Yeah, absolutely. The next thing that I'd add is about UX. So, you know, you don't want to go overboard. We have said that it's preferable to have a different template and therefore a different design from a standard blog post. You know, because you want to include certain UX devices, such as in many cases internal navigation or some kind of chapter structure, and you want the content to be broken up in most cases to be digestible. But that's not permission to go bananas with, you know, the things that we've advised you remove from your blog posts in previous episodes, you know, surrounding this content with all sorts of embellishment, bells and whistles and stuff that's just distracting from the task at hand, which is consume the content. Keep the focus on the reading experience, making it as easy as possible to read, digest, scan, consume the content, support that process. So restrain yourselves in terms of what you put on the page. And that approach also, I think, makes it easier to produce more of them of a good quality. Whereas an over embellished design I've seen in the past can get in the way of producing new content. You know, so much effort required to publish a piece on a page that's overly fancy that it becomes a barrier. And ultimately you want more rather than less pillar pages on a broad range of topics, ideally over time, than just a couple that you've managed to produce while wrestling with the design/development challenges that publishing it held for you. So restraint, simple UX, focus on readability.
Cool. Yeah. And the next one I've got that I think I mentioned before in the social section, but I'll pick it up again, is don't literally, you know, take your pillar page and just post links on social media to the pillar page. It's not giving anybody in the feed any information, anything useful, any kind of education. So it's really just a bad use of social media, and it's not what people are wanting to consume and wanting to do in that feed. You're much better off, you know, taking the kind of key text from it that probably goes a little bit more in depth on particular elements, and then post that within the feed itself, not just a literal link to the pillar page.
Yeah. And then the last one for me is one we touched on a little bit before, but it's about cannibalizing your commercial keywords. So quite often when people, marketers, ungate existing content, there'll be some overlap between what it's written about, what it's optimized for most naturally, and what your website's trying to rank for. Now, as you go forward and create new content, you want to stay away from your commercial keywords, but we'll touch on that in a minute. But where you've got content that is close to or even bang on optimized for a commercial keyword, if you can deviate, if you can move it away subtly, that would be my preference. But my rule of thumb for internal linking is, if there's a commercial page on a topic, always prefer it. Always use that as your link, and only link to the informational page if, you know, there isn't a competing commercial page. CTAs I allow to sort of lean. I wouldn't CTA call to action, you know, with a banner or text call to action. I wouldn't typically point those at commercial website pages for a variety of reasons. But with internal linking, I say always prefer your commercial pages, because it's far more important that they rank for those terms and that they're as high up as possible. So pick and choose your links.
Good shout. Good shout. Right. Okay. Let's move on from that, because we've spent a lot of time talking here how to take that existing content that you already have and ungate it, which, you know, is worthwhile, because that is usually the biggest value to be had. You're likely to already have a whole load of gated content that you can really maximize and optimize and get so much reach from. I think it was worth spending the time to talk through that. But what's next? You know, how do you now think about content as in an ungated way? So the way that I would kind of look at this is take your gated formats and think about what they look like in an ungated way. So to kind of run through a list here of current gated formats and then what they could look like on the other side. So as we've spoken a lot about, ebooks and guides. So if you're thinking about, or how you thought in the past, oh, you know, we have a fantastic topic that we want to cover in detail, let's create an ebook about it, let's create a guide about it. Well, now, you know, you've got that pillar page template to use, whack it up as a pillar page. Just write it as a pillar page and publish it on your website itself.
Absolutely.
Next,
keep going.
okay, I'll keep going. Next is white papers. White papers is a funny one, isn't it? Because I feel like people call things
most white papers are not white papers, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah. But a white paper is research, right? It's meant to be some sort of market research, generally speaking.
Yeah.
They would sit well as a blog post. You know, people in search will often search for market research and are keen to kind of see what the trends are in the market, and it will be found in search. So that white paper as a blog post will get found more and perform much better.
Yeah, I think if you've got data and insights, then blog is great, or potentially pillar page if they're on the topic. I think in most cases, white papers was marketers flattering themselves a little bit in terms of what they were creating, because of course, you know, there are research papers that go to a very different audience via very different channels, and look very different. They're usually just plain with text on white paper, and there's a real place for that, but it isn't what you find in most ebooks, truth be told. So yeah, be honest about what you've created, which I'm sure is great quality and really important, really valuable to your reader. Put it on either a blog post or a pillar page, and let it be found.
Yeah, it's a good clarifying point that we're not talking about scientific research papers here. That
no, could, marketing white papers.
Yeah, we're talking about those fake white papers that are started basically, and dress up as a white paper. It's not really a white paper, is it? Let's start posting them as blogs. Webinars, you've got the traditional webinar format. You know, the horrible platforms like GoTo and things like that you know don't necessarily they don't necessarily kind of promote demand creation and free consumption of content. They kind of restrict this webinar to a few people who actually register. You know, a webinar is still a way to essentially capture contact details. It is a piece of gated content, whilst it is potentially more in depth and a bit more engaging, a bit more human. It's still gated content at the end of the day. And webinars can still be a great thing to do. You know, they can get engagement. They're a great form of long form content that can then be distributed in different ways. You could simply just remove the form from the webinar, and you know, like I just bashed GoTo, I'm sure they have some sort of way to actually remove the form. It was just the first platform that came to my head. But yeah, thinking of webinars not as a kind of lead generation gated activity, but just as a way to kind of get your brand, your people, that long form piece of content in as many people to as many people as possible is a great thing to do. So you could still look at it like a traditional webinar just without the form, without the need to register for it. Or you could do something like a live event that's streamed in the place where your buyers are. You could pre-record something and then distribute that onto YouTube or put it onto your website. Just having it ungated, basically removing that barrier so that more of your audience can consume that content, which is likely to be a really, really fantastic in-depth piece of content too.
Yeah. When you think about it, webinars are really limiting, really limiting. You know, in all the years that I've been doing marketing, you know, I've seen plenty of webinars where the registration numbers were tens or hundreds, you know, and at times that was considered quite successful. It's a tiny number in the grand scheme of things, really small number. And then of course, you know, you get 60% drop off to attendance. And then invariably you start thinking about, well, what can I send to the people that did attend to try and nudge them into the pipeline, which is all, you know, less and less effective nowadays. I was reminded while you were speaking that I heard that HubSpot themselves broke a world record for webinar attendance. And I just Googled the numbers. And so their world record breaking webinar attendance was attended by 10,899 people, which is a big number, but not that big, actually.
Yeah.
You know, and when we consider total addressable market, you know, globalization, and the fact that all happens within like a one-shot window of time and not any day thereafter, it's a really limiting and constraining approach to, you know, what is creating very valuable content. So yeah, live, recorded, ungated is the way to go.
Yeah, I would predict that HubSpot, being the kind of content powerhouse company that they are, they probably then published that webinar to YouTube or ungated it in some kind of way afterwards. I would suspect that they did that because, to be fair, for most webinar platforms, you do still require at least an email address to actually kind of get the software functioning to send out the invites and that kind of thing. But I think the key here is using that webinar as that ungated piece of content. So if you're still using a webinar platform, fine, you probably will still have to have some kind of information pre-filled before you can run it. But just take that piece of content after it and distribute it ungated, because then you're kind of unlocking a huge new audience that wouldn't have registered, wouldn't have attended, and can just consume your content afterwards freely. Cool. Case studies. Do you want? I feel like I've spoken a lot. Do you want to run through case studies?
You know, I'll simply say that, you know, case studies should be gated, should never have been gated. It's mad, I think, to gate them. You want your buyers to see who else is benefiting from trusting and enjoying your solution. So why on earth would you gate that? So case studies are a very valuable proof point, piece of you know, evidence that you are credible, do what you say you can do. That needs to be ungated. That needs to be on your website in page format. Again, not as a PDF that people can download, but as a page that people can navigate to, find, and consume freely. And to hide that critical, you know, classic middle of the funnel, you know, consideration stage content behind a form, away from buyers, crazy.
Criminal activity. It really is. Well, is it worse than pricing?
Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I don't know. What's worse, gating case studies or gating pricing? They're both pretty bad, aren't they?
Well, gating pricing is definitely worse because, you know, whether you have pricing or not is still an option, right? It's a choice. It's a decision point that you can argue both ways, you know. So to say you've got pricing but then gate it is obscene. That is criminal.
Yeah.
You know, whereas the case study thing is just poor choice, I think. But you know, to say that you've got pricing on your website but then hide that behind a form, that's really ineffective. Buyers loathe it nowadays. So very much in favor of, if you're going to have pricing, put that on a web page, call it pricing, and have it visible to all, or don't have it. Simple.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last one, we've got a quite, often gated piece of content is brochures. It might be product brochures. It might be kind of in-depth specification stuff. Again, we would probably just advocate for putting that on a web page where you can. It's often the case that, it is suitable to a web page, but there are some niche cases where, I don't know, just in-depth specs and stuff do just serve themselves well as a PDF. People want PDFs of these for some reason. In that case, you can just ungate the PDF, still have it in PDF format because that's the format. If that's the format that your buyers want it in, cool, just ungate it because then more people can see it.
Yeah, absolutely. And if there's a necessity for some reason to have the brochure or the spec sheet, behind some sort of form, then it probably belongs somewhere else altogether, potentially in a customer dealer area, where they can get access to everything they need more easily. But yeah, having a PDF brochure about a product behind a form, it's probably not doing favors.
Yeah, cool. All right, well, we're up to the hour, so unless you have anything else, Phil, let's call it. Yeah. All right, so yeah, let's wrap it up, and hopefully you enjoyed this episode of Demand Decoded. As always, be sure to follow the Blend LinkedIn page for any of these future live episodes, and you can watch or listen back to any previous episodes on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Just search for Demand Decoded and you'll find it there. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.